Ever since I was a child back in the 1980s, I would spend hours and hours in the local newsagents waiting patiently for a quick go at the latest arcade racing game. I would stand as close as I could to see some of the older kids smash their fastest times, and hoping desperately that they would let me have a go too. And when they did, oh my, I was elated. I could hardly contain my excitement that the older kids not only let me have a go, but they would watch me too, and sometimes even give me some advice. It was moments like this as a child that left the desire to race cars, be it virtually or in real life, permanently ingrained into my brain. So let's start at the very beginning and go back to when jumpsuits, acid wash jeans, denim jackets and sweatbands were at the height of fashion, and see where sim racing all started, and carry it forwards to see where it has brought us now. Prior to the current division between arcade-style racing and sim racing, the earliest attempts at providing driving simulation experiences were arcade racing video games, dating back to Pole Position, which was a 1982 arcade game developed by Namco, which the game publisher Atari publicised for its unbelievable driving realism in providing a Formula One experience behind a racing wheel at the time. It featured other AI cars to race against, crashes caused by collisions with other vehicles and roadside signs, and introduced a qualifying lap concept where the player needs to complete a time trial before they can compete in a Grand Prix race. It also pioneered the third-person rear-view perspective used in most racing games since, with the track's vanishing point swaying side to side as the player approaches corners, for the most part accurately simulating forward movement to the distance. And then 1 year later, in 1983, Pole Position 2 was released, which featured several small improvements, probably the biggest of which was giving the player a choice of various different racetracks to race on, but other than that it was pretty much the same game. TX1, developed by Tatsumi also in 1983, was licensed to Namco, who in turn licensed it to Atari, and therefore the game is considered a successor to Pole Position 2. TX1, however, did place a greater emphasis on realism, so they say, with details such as forcing players to brake or downshift a gear during corners to avoid losing control, and to let go of the accelerator when going into a slide. It also used a simple force feedback tech, which caused the steering wheel to vibrate, and the game also featured a unique 3-screen arcade display for a more sort of 3-dimensional perspective of the track. Another thing it did was it introduced non-linear gameplay, which basically allowed players to choose which path to drive through after each checkpoint, eventually leading to one of 8 or more possible final destinations. Since the mid-1980s, it became a trend for arcade racing games to use hydraulic motion simulator arcade cabinets. This trend was sparked by Sega's Taikan games, which basically means body sensation in Japanese. The Taikan trend began when Yu Suzuki's team at Sega, which was later known as Sega AM2, developed Hang On in 1985, which was a racing video game where the player sits on and moves a motorbike replica to control the in-game actions. Hang On was super popular, and it was a Grand Prix rear-style motorbike racer and was considered the first full-body experience video game. It was also regarded as the first motorbike simulator for its realism at the time, in both handling of the player's motorbike and the AI of the computer-controlled motorcyclists as well. It also used force feedback tech and was one of the first arcade games to use 16-bit graphics, and Sega's Super Scaler tech that allowed pseudo 3D sprite scaling at high frame rates. Suzuki's team at Sega then followed it up with hydraulic motion simulator cabinets for later racing games such as Outrun in 1986. Outrun, apart from being my favourite game of all time, is also known for its pioneering hardware and graphics. It had non-linear gameplay, selectable soundtrack with music composed by Hiroshi Kawaguchi, and the hydraulic motion simulator deluxe arcade cabinet, and the goal of it was to avoid traffic and reach one of the 5 destinations. Staying in 1986, Konami released WEC Le Mans, which was an early car driving simulator based on the 24 Hours of Le Mans. It attempted to realistically simulate car driving, with the car jumping up and down, turning back and forth and spinning up to 180 degrees, with an emphasis on acceleration, braking and gear shifting, along with the need for counter steering to avoid spinouts. It also featured a day-night cycle, accurately simulated courses, and force feedback to simulate road vibration in the form of a vibrating steering wheel that reacts to the driver's acceleration and off-road bumps. So, stepping back a little to the first developments of racing games with simulation pretensions on a home system is believed to have been Chequered Flag, which was released by Scion on the 8-bit ZX Spectrum back in 1983. Now, Chequered Flag was the only game of its class until 1986, when REVS was released. REVS was a Formula 3 sim that delivered a semi-realistic driving experience by Jeff Crammond that ran on the Commodore 64 and the BBC Micro. And oddly enough, this is the game that made me fall in love with Silverstone, even though these days, looking at that game, you can barely recognise it at all. And then in 1988, we saw some 3D polygon graphics, and they appeared in a game called Winning Run by Namco, which was a major commercial success over in Japan, and a fairly moderate success in the West as well. And then 1 year later, in 1989, Atari's Hard Driving roared onto everyone's home computers, where it was one of the most widely played simulators up to that point. Though it is most certainly worth mentioning that both of these titles were breaking down huge barriers when it came to 3D polygonal graphics. During the late 1980s to the early 1990s, arcade racing games had become increasingly elaborate. Hydraulic motion simulator arcade cabinets were becoming commonplace, with arcade races such as Virtua Racing. Virtua Racing was one of the highest grossing arcade games of 1992 and 1993. It was regarded as one of the most influential video games of all time, laying the foundations for subsequent 3D racing games and popularising 3D polygon graphics. And then in 1993, Daytona USA. This game focused on simulating the speed and thrills of racing, and at the same time, arcade racing games gradually moved away from the more difficult simulation style like of pole position, and by the early 1990s, arcade racing games had less emphasis on realistic handling or physics and more emphasis on fast-paced action like speed and thrills, proper arcadey stuff. Sim racing as we know it today is generally acknowledged to have really taken off in 1989 with the introduction of Indianapolis 500. The game is often generally regarded as the personal computer's first true auto racing sim. Unlike most other racing games at the time, Indy 500 attempted to simulate realistic physics and telemetry, such as its portrayal of the relationship between the fore-contact area of the tyres and curb interaction, as well as the loss of grip when making a high-speed turn, forcing the player to adopt a proper racing line and believable throttle-to-brake interaction. It also featured a garage facility to allow players to enact modifications to their vehicle, including adjustments to the tyres, the shocks, wings. With this game, players could race the full 500 miles or 800 kilometers, where even a blowout after 450 miles would take the player out of the competition. The simulation sold over 200,000 copies, and it was around this time that sim racing began distinguishing itself from arcade-style racing. Consoles then saw the release of Human Entertainment's Fastest 1 for the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis in 1991. This was considered the most realistic Formula 1 racing simulation up to that time. The next major milestone was the 1992 release of Formula 1 Grand Prix, which was also called World Circuit in some markets, and was developed by Microprose. This moved the genre along significantly. Multiplayer was made possible by allowing different drivers to take turns, and then racers could also hook up their machines for racing via a null modem cable, though this did only allow 2 drivers to race. Leagues emerged where drivers would then submit records of their single-player races to compare with other drivers, and this was also the first sim in which drafting or slipstreaming was possible. Papyrus then followed up Indy 500 with IndyCar Racing in 1993, which surpassed Formula 1 Grand Prix in pretty much all areas. Papyrus later released more tracks and a final expansion, which included the Indianapolis track plus a paint kit, and now drivers could easily customize their cars. IndyCar Racing sold about 300,000 copies. The first variant of Papyrus's NASCAR Racing series was launched in 1994 in SVGA, which basically translates to a resolution of 800 by 600. It pushed the PCs of the time to the limit. Suddenly, a resolution of 320 by 200 seemed a very poor option, and NASCAR Racing was the race sim of choice for anyone with a capable PC, particularly in North America. It was the first sim where cars no longer looked like boxes. It keyed in on sophisticated physics modelling. NASCAR Racing sold over 1 million units. Moreover, the first real online racing started with NASCAR Racing using the Hawaii dial-in servers, and it was not uncommon for these early sim races to have $300 to $1,500 phone bills. Online racing had seen its first true realization, and to many, this was the dawn of real sim racing. 1995 saw the release of IndyCar Racing 2, updating the first version with the new NASCAR graphics engine. And then, a year later, to much anticipation, Microprose released the successor to Formula 1 Grand Prix, Grand Prix 2. Grand Prix 2 became successful not just because of its detailed and thorough simulation of the 1994 Formula 1 season, but also because it was customizable. This was achievable by way of online community. Players could pretty much change everything about the game: drivers, teams, graphics, physics, car shapes, and eventually even the racetracks. In 1996, NASCAR Racing 2 was released, further improving on the original, and the number of sim racers within the community began to grow exponentially. The Total Entertainment Network multiplayer hosting service, nicknamed 10, was introduced and went live in November 1997 with the backing of NASCAR, and the online sim racing community exploded. Then in 1997, Polyphony Digital released Gran Turismo for the PlayStation. It was considered the most realistic racing simulation for consoles at the time, featuring a wealth of meticulous tuning options and an open-ended career mode where players had to undertake driving tests to acquire driving licenses, earn their way into races, and choose their own career path. Gran Turismo introduced the racing simulation genre to home consoles, becoming the basis for all modern racing simulations on video game consoles going forward. It was around this time that graphics accelerator cards brought a new level of realism to the graphics and physics of sim racing games. These new graphics processing units provided texture mapping, anti-aliasing, and particle effects, and they had the capability to perform polygonal calculations way faster while taking the load off the main processor. F1 Racing Simulation by Ubisoft was among the first to utilize this new technology in 1997. Following on in 1997, TORCS, which stands for the Open Racing Car Simulator, was released. TORCS was open source, making it even easier for modding teams to add new features and even create whole new games. Another milestone in sim racing came in 1998 with the release of Papyrus's Grand Prix Legends, which was based on the 1967 F1 season. It was hailed as outstanding in all areas, especially in its physics and sound design. For many players, their first real experience of sim racing was through GPL, or Grand Prix Legends, or one of its many derivatives, such as NASCAR Racing 2003, the release of the groundbreaking third-party add-on for GPL, VROC, Virtual Racers Online Connection, which allowed players to join together online and race in leagues. Then in 1999, Sega's arcade game Ferarri F355 Challenge was ported to the Dreamcast and was considered the most accurate simulation of the Ferrari F355 possible up until that time. Its absolute focus on realism was considered unusual for an arcade console game at that time. Since Grand Prix Legends, its publisher Image Space Incorporated has produced its own sims such as Sports Car GT in 1999, with the officially licensed F1 series starting in 2000, all published by Electronic Arts. 1999 also saw the release of Gran Turismo 2, the sequel to Gran Turismo, the gameplay, physics and graphics being very similar. The only real noticeable difference in vehicle dynamics was the brakes, which became much less likely to lock up and cause the vehicle to oversteer. Other major changes are the expanded number of cars, tracks and races in simulation mode. After years of development, Microprose released Grand Prix 3, which used a more modern graphics engine and featured the same customizable structure of GP2. However, GP3 was not as well received as its predecessor due to a lack of full online multiplayer and the fact that it was based on the same outdated graphics engine as GP2. However, because the graphical and physical similarities between the two games, the game was still popular with modders who were able to port mod tracks and cars directly into GP3. In 2001, Polyphony Digital released Gran Turismo 3 on the PlayStation 2, and like its predecessors, the game opened to critical acclaim and was a commercial success and went on to become the best-selling game in the series to date, as well as the second best-selling PlayStation 2 game of all time, and is still the best-selling PlayStation exclusive, with the game selling 14 million copies since its release. It is still considered to be one of the greatest video games of all time. In 2003, a three-man team released Live for Speed. Among other things, the physics engine of this game simulated tyres, the suspension, aerodynamics, the drivetrain, several gearbox types, clutch overheating, car body damage and engine damage. The tyre model featured dynamic wear, dynamic dirt, flat spots, hot spots and tyre wall deformation. In 2004, rally fans received the first true rally sim with Richard Burns Rally, which to this day is still recognised by its community as the best rally sim available. Much like most sims from the graphical, accelerator and modern era, the game is highly modifiable and has third-party mods that introduce anything from new cars to new physics. Also in 2004, Polyphony Digital released Gran Turismo 4, the fourth installment of the franchise, and compared with Gran Turismo 3, the graphics were greatly improved with the more detail on cars and tracks despite running on the same PlayStation 2 hardware. The physics are also greatly improved with the major upgrade that cars can now experience body movements such as pitching, forwards and backwards rolling under braking, and barriers have considerably more friction to slow down the cars in this game in an attempt to stop the use of wall riding. But there is minimal friction between cars, so the advantage obtained by running into the side of another car instead of braking is still present. 2005 saw Image Space Incorporated releasing rFactor, a highly modifiable sim based on their Motor 2 physics engine. Notable for its initial download-only distribution model, rFactor originally released with fictional cars and tracks. Thanks to its enthusiastic and ongoing modding community, the game has remained as one of the best racing sims around. Then in 2006, Simbin Studios released GTR 2, a sports car racing simulator developed with input from the actual racing teams which took part in the FIA GT 2003 and 2004 seasons. It has also received widespread acclaim and has been noted for its high levels of technical and driving realism with regards to sports car racing. Also in 2006, Kunos Simulazioni released NetKar Pro, which aimed to bring together highly accurate physics and sound modelling, as well as DirectX 9 graphics. Development tools for modifying NetKar Pro were announced, although the game is now considered obsolete due to the release of the company's other sim, Assetto Corsa. And then in 2008, David Kamer, co-founder of the now defunct Papyrus, released iRacing, a multiplayer-orientated simulator run on a subscription model. 2010 saw the release of Gran Turismo 5. The game marks the first entry in the series with online races with support for up to 16 players. A damage model has also been included with variations of damage depending on the car. It had over 1,000 cars, 29 different locations, 77 different tracks, and a track generator are also available in the game. Dynamic time and weather effects also made their debut in the series. In 2012, ImageSpace Incorporated launched the open beta of rFactor 2. It went out of beta in 2013, mostly unfinished, and was met with backlash from players. However, in 2016, Studio 397 took over development of rFactor 2 with the aim to revamp and revive the title, making a huge effort to bring the series back to its prime with extensive customization and detailed physics. In 2013, Sector 3 Studios, formerly Simbin, released RaceRoom, a free-to-play simulator for Microsoft Windows. And around exactly the same time, Exotypos also released X Motor Racing, which had full support for the newly released direct drive wheels. 2013 also saw the much anticipated release of Gran Turismo 6, the sixth major release in the Gran Turismo video game series. It was released worldwide on December 6, 2013 and was met with a hugely positive reception. New features included the addition of more cars and tracks, improvements to the car customization options, and partnerships with the Goodwood Festival Speed, the Ayrton Senna Institute, the FIA and NASCAR. In 2015, Slightly Mad Studios launched Project Cars for Windows, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. This game was unique in that it was crowdfunded. CARS standing for Community Assisted Racing Simulator. In 2016, Brazil's Riser Studios released Automobilista, a racing simulator featuring, among others, Formula Truck Racing, Rallycross, and some lesser-known Brazilian racing classes. The game was also based on their well-known stock car Extreme, which was again based on the ImageSpace Incorporated Motor 2 engine. In 2017, Slightly Mad Studios released the successor to Project Cars. Project Cars 2 used suggestions from the community to help improve upon the previous version, including features such as Rallycross and improved graphics. And in May 2019, Kunos Simulazioni launched Assetto Corsa Competizione, the spiritual successor to their wildly successful Assetto Corsa. The game aims to provide an accurate simulation of GT3 racing and uses the official license for the Blancpain GT Endurance series as well as the Unreal Engine 4 for vastly improved graphics. In March 2020, Riser Studios released Automobilista 2, a successor to their extremely popular Automobilista. The game features many cars from old F1 cars to trucks. The game also features both real and fictional tracks. Many of the real tracks like Jerez and others get laser scanned for a perfect recreation of the track. The game also uses the Madness engine, the same one used for the Project Cars 2 game. 2022 saw the release of Gran Turismo 7. The game is the 8th mainline installment in the Gran Turismo series, including Gran Turismo Sport, which was released in 2017. The game was announced on June 11, 2020 at the PlayStation 5 reveal event and was released on March 4, 2022 for PlayStation 4 and for PlayStation 5, making it the first multi-console installment in the series. The game also features virtual reality support compatible with the PlayStation VR 2. Gran Turismo 7 also features the return of dynamic time and dynamic weather, which previously appeared in Gran Turismo 5 and Gran Turismo 6. Despite the game including a single-player campaign like with Gran Turismo Sport, the game requires a constant internet connection in order for players to be able to save their progress. The series creator, Kazunori Yamauchi, explains that this decision was made to prevent hacking and cheating. Arcade mode, however, is fully playable offline. So there we have it, the almost entire evolution of sim racing from its 8-bit inception to the hyper-real 3D graphics of today. I hope this video has entertained you enough for me to earn a like and perhaps a sub, and I will see you in the next one.